Well, good afternoon. At this very moment, registration has opened for the 31st Annual Emerging Issues Forum, Future Work. 31. It's a long list of issues that we have dealt with in this organization. And yet, I think this forum, scheduled for February 8th and 9th, 2016, here in Raleigh, is actually going to be the most important convening of leaders from all across the state of North Carolina. This February, we want to focus on this question of the future of work, of jobs, of what it will mean to have technological automation, perhaps change the kinds and numbers of jobs that we have, of what it looks like to have new platforms that allow us to work with each other in completely different ways, and what it means to think about a world in which work may not be an opportunity for some. I'm really excited to be joined today by 4 esteemed guests. I'm excited because I suspect that there are some people who may be watching today who are asking this question. So, how can we know what is the future of work? Or maybe the question is, even if we know what the future of work looks like, how can we do anything about it? How do we respond as a state? How do we come together as a public, private, not-for-profit sector to really design a collaborative response that works for all people? I want to say that for those of you who think that coming to this Emerging Issues Forum is an opportunity to come together and talk about an issue around which we'll be passive observers, I'm excited that I've got 4 people with me today who will agree with me that that's not enough. February 8th and 9th of 2016 will be focused on what we do as a state. And I'm excited that you will be part of that conversation. So let me quickly introduce the wonderful people we have with us today. First, I'll introduce Michael Walden, who is the William Neal Reynolds Professor of Applied Economics and Resources here at NC State. He is joined by Alexandra Sirota of the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, part of the North Carolina Justice Center. Beside her is Jay Shalin of the John William Pope Center for Higher Education Policy. And we'll also hear from a friend who is from the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, but he's joining us from New York, which says everything you need to know about the future of work. Mike, you've been spending a lot of time thinking about what all of the global and national headlines that are asking us to think about the future of work mean for North Carolina. Would you take us through some of the work that you've been doing, please?
I will, Anita, and thank you. I think that this concern we have about the future work and emphasis on the future work may be really the question of the century. Do we have the slide set ready to go? I have a slide set that's going to run us through, I think, some of the key ideas. If we look around the world, for example, if you go to Japan and you go into a hotel in Japan, you may be greeted by a robot at the check-in desk rather than a live person. Driverless cars, of course, that's been a hot topic, and many futurists think that will be the way that we will get around, both in terms of moving ourselves as well as the trucking industry. 3D manufacturing. This is the kind of manufacturing some say will replace the factory floor and the workers on the factory floor, where, for example, my wife and I were recently looking for a refrigerator and we have a specific size we're looking for. If we had a 3D manufacturing component in our home, we could produce the exact kind of refrigerator that we wanted. So all of these examples that I've given are examples of where technology has the potential to replace human labor. And if you're a business person, you can see many advantages of having a machine or a robot do the tasks that an individual's done. That machine or robot, for example, will not lobby for higher pay raises, no vacation needed. You can precisely schedule and time and tune that robot or machine. And some say on the upside, this is going to remove the locational benefits that we've seen impact, particularly here in North Carolina, some workers who used to have jobs in, for example, the textile and furniture industries, and those jobs no longer exist because they've moved offshore. Well, if business is done and manufacturing is done with robots, maybe those enterprises can come back. So this is a big issue. It's not really a new issue. If you remember your history, in the 17th century, there was a movement to bring in technology and machines to manufacture apparel goods in England. There were a group of people called Luddites who rebelled against that, and they went around in the evening and actually broke into factories and tried to destroy those machines. We've had more recent examples, not so much of that kind of activity, but certainly the kind of shift from labor to technology. In the current and last century, for example, in the 20th century, we had the advent of the tractor, which released millions of farmers for other kinds of work. They fortunately went into the factories and then subsequently went into the service sector, but the point is that we've had many examples of worker dislocation. The economist John Maynard Keynes actually coined the term technological unemployment to indicate that we're always seeing machines, technology replacing labor. The key question is whether we can see new jobs emerge that will take the labor that is that's being replaced by technology. Now, this change that we've seen specifically in factories and some other sectors of our economy, many economists say has had a big impact, adverse impact on the middle class. In fact, they argue that this is the main reason we've seen a relative decline in the size of the middle class in the U.S. over the last roughly 30 or 40 years. It's because, for example, those good-paying manufacturing jobs are being replaced by technology, robots, etc. In particular, if we look at a subdivision of jobs in terms of tasks, it is routine tasks. It's tasks where there is the same kind of activity being done over and over that in the past has been able to be replaced by technology. Think the assembly line with Henry Ford, where now we have machines that are putting on those fenders rather than people. But many futurists say that technology is becoming so adept that there are going to be cognitive tasks that perhaps will be taken over by technology down the road. So it looks as if this issue of technological unemployment is being spread to many other kinds of occupations. And if we look down the line and look at some of the advances in technology that are already here or being worked on, things like artificial intelligence, virtualization, nanotechnology, the Internet of Everything. These are leaps and bounds technologies that are above what we used to have, and again, that is putting technology, I think, in a position to be able to expand into many other different kinds of occupations. In fact, one futurist recently said that the question is not what technology will do next, it's instead the question is what technology won't be able to do. Now, what kind of an impact might we see as we try to look several decades out into the future? What kind of impact might we see technology and technological employment have on our workforce? Well, there have actually been several studies of this impact, and interestingly, these studies from different institutions all seem to be coming to the same conclusion, and that is that if you look at the occupations we now have in the country, about half of those face a very high chance of being done by technology and machinery in the future rather than by humans. So roughly half of the tasks that are done by people today may be done by technology down the road. What this is going to lead to, of course, are several socioeconomic changes. One concern is that this is going to create a new underclass. In fact, some people have already coined the term precariats, as individuals who no longer will be able to find work because they don't have the right skills. The work simply is not going to be there, and the question is, if that is an issue down the road, what do we need to do public policy-wise in order to address that? what kind of support from the public sector, if any, might we need to be thinking about if indeed we're looking at potentially a new underclass who are without work due to technological unemployment. Or, on the upside, these worries may be for naught. It may be that we'll repeat the past. Again, if you look at all of the workers who worked on the farm 100 years ago, millions of those folks have moved off the farm. Initially, they did find work in the factories. When mechanization came to the factories, that's when the service sector sprung up. So there are many who say that this is not really a worry because the economy will always respond, income will always be earned, and that will be spent, and that will create new kinds of jobs. These could be jobs in a broad array of areas, very, very difficult, however, to predict. I think one thing is for certain, though. We need to be looking at the possibility of increased technological unemployment, and we need to look at what the response might be from the educational sector in order to address this. We need to look at the role of K through 12, colleges. We need, I think, to re-examine vocational training. We need to look at the role of technology in education, perhaps in order to bend the cost curve in education. And we need, I think, to worry about reskilling. It's often said in the past that a worker will change his or her job, his or her employer 2 or 3 times in their work career. Some are saying that that worker in the future will change his or her occupation 2 or 3 times, which means that many workers will have to go back to school in order to get reskilled. I think it's also going to mean that we're going to need to rethink how we assist those who are unemployed in order to encourage reskilling. One example might be to take monthly unemployment payments, combine them into a retraining voucher to encourage people who are without work due to structural issues to get retrained. I think that we need a system, perhaps, to monitor this. I would like states to think about something I call an early warning system of occupational change, where we use existing data that are derived and follow and track occupations in order to try to ascertain trends in occupations in the decades ahead, so we get some forewarning of where these changes may occur and what that might imply for the educational system. We're not going to be able to control this. We're not going to be able to restrain technological advances, but I think half the battle is knowing that this may occur, and we can take plans, hopefully, to address it. Thank you.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for sharing that information with us. We are really fortunate in North Carolina to have somebody who's thinking about these issues and not only tracking the numbers, but helping us think about what potential responses might be. Our team here at IEI has also been thinking a bit about numbers. In fact, using much of the research that you've done in addition to some data from the Department of Commerce, we've tried to do some visualizations about what this conversation means for each of North Carolina's 100 counties. We're sitting here in the Emerging Issues Commons, and you all may have noted behind us the data visualization rolling. For those of you who want to be able to go in and play with it a bit more, let me encourage you to visit us at emergingissuescommons.org. Again, that's emergingissuescommons.org, or you may simply click on the link on the program that you're watching right now. Let's just look at a couple of examples of the data that we have available for you. In this first visualization, you can see that the total potential job losses look like for your individual county. You heard Mike refer to some 1.2 million jobs in our state today at risk for elimination due to technological automation. Here you can see what that means for each county. In this next visualization, we dig a bit deeper and focus just on retail jobs. Here you can see that the projected losses range from 50 jobs in a small county like Hyde or Terrell and go all the way up to 207,000 jobs in a larger county like Mecklenburg. What if you wanted to go beyond industry sectors and to look at particular occupations? Let's stay with retail for a moment. Here you can see on the screen the number of jobs projected to be eliminated for retail salespersons alone. In Mecklenburg County, we're looking at 50,270 jobs. For Guilford, those losses total 21,770,000 statewide. The total number of retail sales jobs, that is, those people that we currently depend on to help us when we go into stores, total elimination, 140,000 jobs. Now, Mike and panelists will spend some time talking about when we can expect to see some of these changes. But I'm reminded that recently I was in a grocery store in Sydney, Australia, and there was one cashier who was overseeing 19 automated cash registers. One person in the entire store. So what we're talking about in the future of work is already here in many places in the nation, and it's coming to a region near us. It's important to recognize that as other nations are dealing with this issue, so are other states in the nation. And I am happy at this moment to be able to pass the baton to Devin Fiddler, who, as I mentioned earlier, is with the Institute for the Future.
Yeah, certainly. So thank you for the opportunity to participate today. So just a little bit of context. The Institute for the Future is a 48-year-old nonprofit research center based in Palo Alto that was originally founded by a group of engineers who were on something called the ARPANET. So before the internet, there was the ARPANET, you know, the early Defense Department network of computers. And back when there were just 8 of them, they basically, this group of engineers created the Institute as a place to sort of look at the implications of this beyond just the engineering. And I think this problem is very much in that space, right? So one of the things we've been doing quite a bit is working with governments, both regional governments and national governments, to think about how to respond to this shifting environment. So I think the first point is that there is a sense, you know, I've just come just this last week from an open innovation forum in Europe, and I think there's a sense now at a global scale that we really are at a pivot point, that it is the case that I think everything Mike laid out is perfectly true, but even more immediately we're seeing a change in the nature of work and in the nature of organizations. If you look at sort of the companies, you know, my organization's based in Silicon Valley. If you look at the companies that are getting a lot of attention in Silicon Valley right now, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the Kickstarters, all of them work on business models that really couldn't have existed 20 years ago. They all employ technologies in ways that, you know, would not have been possible, you know, a decade or two ago. That's, I think, really interesting. The idea that technology is not only impacting jobs as we know them, but also impacting organizations as we know them, and that's a big part of what the Institute is looking at. What that translates to at the governmental level is people beginning to rethink. I think Mike touched on the importance of education in this environment. So looking at what skills are becoming more valuable in an increasingly automated environment is one thing we've done quite a bit of. You can imagine skills that are really difficult to be captured by automation. Things like sense making, social intelligence. Even ability to use new kinds of media, right? A literacy with new kinds of media, all increasing in value. Alongside that, skills in the computational area, right? Skills like computational thinking also becoming more valuable. So definitely a rethinking of how to get a workforce together that really can take advantage of these tools that Mike's described as they're emerging and potentially, kind of move out of the way before, traditional jobs are automated. The other piece I think that's very interesting is a sort of strategic level conversation. So there are countries and states as well beginning to rethink their position economically as a result of this. When we saw the emergence of globalization, we saw something very similar. Countries kind of realigning themselves to position themselves relative to this big shift, right? Now we're seeing, for example, China has just created a unified reputation system for all internet platforms. So if you have a reputation on, say, Airbnb, that doesn't necessarily transfer to your reputation on Uber here, but China has been thinking about this and decided, oh, well, what we're going to do is create a unified reputation system. And, perhaps ominously, they've included some civic measures as well. So your kind of credit score for online platform use and your citizenry score are mixed in some ways. Again, sort of an ominous signal, but I think a sign that something really big is shifting. We've spoken with some Southeast Asian countries that are actually thinking of making revenue from international freelancing tax-free as a way to create really, much as China made itself the workshop of the world when physical manufacturing was able to be outsourced very easily, countries are now looking at this emergence of freelancing work, this emergence of platform work, and thinking, oh, well, what if we could position ourselves to, kind of most effectively take advantage of that? I was in the Philippines recently, and there's actually a statue in the Philippines dedicated to the freelance worker, right? Kind of a monument to freelance work. I think there's a sense of, this is a new source of international cash flows that's going to, kind of going to increase over time, and positioning relative to that is really key. And then final point, that extends to the local level as well. So we've worked with a couple of state governments and one city office of economic and workforce opportunities now to really rethink, in this environment, how do you maximize the positives of automation and freelancing while minimizing the negatives? So on the one hand, as Mike pointed out, these technologies can potentially erode the middle class if handled poorly, or transfer risk to risks or additional costs to the workers. But they can also open up new, new ways of working. It's possible to be far more flexible. It does create a new level of entrepreneurship, so individuals are, kind of able to get much more agency over how they work and what their work looks like. And then also, very interestingly, it gives people access to productive capacity. So anyone listening to this broadcast right now could go on to a freelancing platform like, say, Mechanical Turk, or better, kind of better suited for this, something like Upwork, and actually hire your own staff and begin to, kind of produce. You can use Alibaba to access manufacturing production capacity. This is something new, and I think really requires us to rethink some of the assumptions we have about how jobs and job growth traditionally work. I think in this environment, it becomes important to really go back to the drawing board and say, okay, some of what we know traditionally is true, but some of what we know, or what we think we know, isn't true in this environment. So I think there's a big rush right now to begin to sort that out, right? Look at what has changed in this environment and what really is, kind of a continuity, and we can rely on received wisdom.
Devin, I want to thank you for that almost mind-blowing sense of how much is changing in the world of work. Now I want to bring in our other two panels, and we're going to engage in a conversation. It's a conversation among us, but it's also a conversation with you. And so let me encourage you to continue to submit questions. You can do that through the Google Hangout, or you can do that by sending in a tweet to # IEI FutureWork. I'm so excited about this conversation that I'm just going to offer Complimentary registration to the 2016 Emerging Issues Forum to the next 5 questions that come in to us. But make them hard questions, please. We want these panelists to work for lunch. So let's turn now, Alexandra, to you and Jay and bring you into this conversation. There are a lot of really smart people like Devin saying that this technological shift may bring with it opportunity, but as Mike has pointed out, may also bring with it some real pain. Talk a little bit from your perspective of where you see the pain points and what worries you when we talk about the future of work.
That's great. Thank you, Anita. I think from our perspective at the Budget and Tax Center and the broader Justice Center, where we focus on really addressing poverty in our state and making sure that the economy works for all, this is a critical issue. And as we travel across the state, talking with folks and communities, they're already beginning to recognize it. So this is not just an academic or policy conversation, it's a day-to-day conversation. And that's because the nature of workers' relationships with their employers are changing. We talked about the different platforms that now exist, the different arrangements or contracts that exist between employers and workers. And all of that has created a lot of insecurity because not only are those contracts changing, but the nature of our policy system has changed. Many of the insurance systems that existed have been eroded over the past few years in North Carolina. They don't perhaps fit with what the future of work will look like. And so I think there's a lot of concern around how do we design our policy systems given this future of work, and how do we understand the relationship between employers and workers that will, I think, first and foremost focus on making sure the benefits are broadly shared, and that can start with wages and educational increases. But certainly we know that this is an opportunity now to address immediately what people are feeling and build for the future, and it's exciting, like you say.
So Jay, you participated in our 2016 working group, a group of amazing people who came together to help us think about this at the programmatic and policy level. But I also want to ask you the same question at a more personal level. What do you think the everyday North Carolinian is feeling as they participate, perhaps even unknowingly, in this transformation of the world of work?
I'm not too sure there is an everyday North Carolinian who is representative of the whole. There are certainly some people who are very at risk in this environment. The person who does a rudimentary job that is easily replaced by technology. And I think there are going to be some very skilled people who are going to be surprised in the near future. On the other hand, North Carolina, if you look at the triangle here, we're a magnet for the people who are creating this technological change. True. So for them, they're salivating. So you have very different responses. I don't think that there is a single person that represents everybody here.
Fair enough. You know, our 2015 forum focused on innovation, and it was focused on the people and companies that were making it based on technology, and I agree, there was a lot of salivating going on. So, but there's another side. There's this more questionable side, and questionable not because it may not hold new opportunities, but questionable because it's hard for us, as Devin has pointed out, as Mike has pointed out, to figure out how we navigate a world for which we have no rules, for which we have no blueprint. Mike talked about some policy prescriptions, and Alexandra, you began to raise some of those in your answer to my question. Jay, what do you say about the role of policy in helping North Carolina prepare for and respond to these changes?
Well, before policy, you sort of have to start with vision. And I've heard, I mean, in our working group, we've kind of heard of very opposite polar visions, one in which innovation is going to, don't worry about it, innovation is going to produce jobs for everybody, a very hopeful vision. We also had another very hopeful vision that, you know, don't worry about it, the machines are going to do all the work. We can just be on vacation all the time, which I don't know whether either one of those is, you know, life is usually a gray area. I think what we have to consider, and also there's another vision that is very dark, in which we're all going to be out of work, and so we need a guaranteed minimum income. And I kind of look at, maybe we just shouldn't just go completely in any single direction, and maybe we have to kind of look at those policies that are likely to continue high employment. I think on a national level, we kind of have to look at, say, there's no doubt that we have to look at our immigration policy. Can we continue to expand the labor supply at a rapid rate when the job supply seems to be diminishing? Our tax and trade policies need a look. We tax income. Other countries tend to tax value added. The way that works out is we're basically subsidizing their exports as we import their stuff. So we may have to look at things like that. We also have to answer questions. Are we concerned about specific development in, say, certain regions, or are we more concerned about the total level of development of new jobs? Because if you try to target development to areas that are not very promising, you're going to have less overall development than if you focus on areas where development is happening all by itself. So these are the kinds of things that kind of play a little small ball here, try to sustain employment as best we can, and by doing so, that prolongs any misery or any greater misery, so that maybe innovation can come along and, at least in part, rescue us.
So, Mike, let me put you on the spot here, if I might, because when I went through the data on the job losses by county, we looked at retail sales, and we were looking at maybe 50 jobs in a county like Terrell or Hope. But those are counties for which 50 jobs really matter. So let's explore Jay's point about economic development policy for a moment. If we overlay this issue of technological automation, what does it say about how we target our economic development policy?
Well, there's no, I've been in North Carolina for almost 40 years. There's no question that over that 40-year time span, we have seen a divergence of economic growth. Economic growth strong in the metro areas, Charlotte, Triangle, Triad. Of course, that's where the big universities are. That's where the innovation is occurring. That's where the college graduates are and want to be. And much slower economic growth in the rural areas. I think the kinds of changes we've been talking about probably will exacerbate that. So I'm not hopeful that we're going to be able to see all counties grow at the same rate. I think one of the things, I've actually been looking at this, as you know, for a while. One of the things I've come away with is we don't know what the future is going to be in 2050. When I was a young PhD graduate, I thought I could predict everything.
And you can't?
The older I get, I know I can predict very little. But I think two things. One is we need to track what's happening. That's why I think a big part of this would be to set up a system where we're seeing what occupations are expanding, what occupations are contracting, where is technological unemployment coming. And then the other thing is to be nimble. I think our public institutions need to be nimble, our educational institutions need to be nimble, our public policy regarding economic development needs to be nimble. It needs to be willing to change very, very rapidly to changing circumstances.
So, Alexandra, where do you start?
That's a good question. I just want to say that I think it's great to hear that there's agreement that there is a role for public policy here, because I do think that that's the case, and I think insofar as we can address the barriers that exist for certain places or certain groups now, that's going to be critical. I can envision a way in which we start to break down barriers for children of color particularly, early in life so that they have that good start to do well in the future workforce. I think addressing some of the connectivity for rural communities into metro regions is going to be critical. Whether
and say more about what you mean there.
You know, is that broadband? Is that beyond broadband some new technologies? But as we're seeing these innovations and these new technologies emerge, how do we make sure that the folks across the state are connected into those opportunities? But I think starting there is one piece, building that infrastructure, those institutions that create opportunity across the board. I think also I would emphasize right now the focus on wages. I think, you know, we can be proactive right now in determining the trajectory, I think, in some ways. You know, dependent on whether we have consumers who will demand more goods and services from certain sectors, even as technology continues and automation continues, that will mean new areas of job growth and opportunity. So I do think that is a very clear first point to start with, is really how do we grow wages in North Carolina. And then the pipeline issue. I mean, we've both all mentioned that, and I think, you know, that pipeline starts young, but it means lifelong learning, and it means designing those systems with the kinds of high-tech training programs and the kind of modules that people can move in and out as they need the training to advance, to retrain for a new opportunity. That nimbleness is going to be critical, that flexibility, and our systems at our community colleges are moving in that direction as they think about credentialing, but we need more of that. And then I would just add that we can't ignore the role of our public university systems too. Even as there'll be more technology, we'll also need thinkers, we'll also need folks who are understanding the history and the future context. Given that history, we'll also need people who are artisans. And so again, I think there's a great potential, but as we've all stated, it's really up to us to design the framework and not predict the future, but perhaps drive us towards the best future for our state.
Thank you. Jay, where would you start? Given all the things we could do, first step.
Well, I think there's some good things happening. First thing I would do is I would change a vision to where we aren't thinking in terms of directing how things go, but letting them happen and trying to remove barriers that are in the way. I would rather see, you know, businesses that are existing in North Carolina have roadblocks removed rather than give incentives to companies from the outside. That's one thing. I'm in total disagreement that wages are something that can be controlled. If you arbitrarily raise wages and try to institute some sort of or raise the minimum wage, you're going to see less employment, not more. So these are the kinds of barriers that we either want to keep away or remove in the future. There's certainly so that is more where I'm thinking that we need to let the private industry work its magic, because these are people who their money is at risk when they invest. So they tend to make very wise decisions. There tends to be less skin in the game from public organizations, so that's kind of where I stand.
I can feel a response, Alexandra, so I'll give you a chance. And Mike, I thought I felt a response from you too, so let's talk about it.
I think we all have skin in the game as it relates to this topic. And certainly working families across North Carolina know that the way in which we think about this and set a vision for our state will redound to their families, next generations, current families now. And so I think, you know, it's putting in place the framework, and perhaps direction isn't the word that I should have used, but I think we all know that policies matter, that building the framework so that policy responses are receptive to this. I think no one on this panel wants to see families with experiencing massive job loss and going hungry. We don't want that to happen. And so we do need to think about wages, or income. We need to understand how are people going to survive in a marketplace that is changing. What's the role of the public sector? What's the role of the private sector in that environment? And I think it's going to take creativity, and I think it's going to take a lot of moving beyond where we've been in the past and the sort of boxes that we've thought in, because there's just a lot of issues that come up as you begin to think about this.
I'm going to give Mike an opportunity to jump in here, and I'm going to begin to get some of the questions that you all have been sending in. So if you haven't already tweeted in or sent your question via the Google Hangout, this is your moment. Mike?
Well, I think the common thread, if I can be bold to say this, among all of us here has been that a crucial part of adapting to these changes in the work environment and the economy will be education and training. And I think the whole institution of education is going to undergo a massive change in coming decades. How we educate, the techniques we use to educate, re-education of the workforce. I think we're going to see a bigger mix of young people and middle-aged people at community colleges and universities. So I find that very positive, and that we can all agree that that's going to be a key. Again, the other thing that I'll point out and re-emphasize is that I think one of the things that makes folks, we were talking about the average North Carolinian, makes folks who get up in the morning and they've got to take care of their family, try to earn enough to get by, etc., is they get hit with trends and forces that are beyond their control, and they don't understand where that came from. And I think that obviously has economic impacts on them, also psychological impacts on them. So again, to the extent we can't control these forces and trends, but if we can identify them and get ahead of the change and perceive, hey, we know this is coming, we know this is going to affect this number of jobs and this number of occupations, then I think we can better prepare our response and better prepare individuals who are impacted to go with the punches, if I will.
Terrific. First question up. So we've been talking a lot at the state level, but we've got many people who are worried about my backyard. And the question is, what should a local economic developer or workforce developer be doing right now to prepare their community for these changes? Jay?
I really would hesitate to advise them. I think the thing that really has to be focused on is working on individuals rather than programs. I think that if you give an individual character, they will rise up. Therefore, that is both character and skills. But I think that you have to focus on the person, each individual person, so that they can take advantage of many opportunities. And so I would also say that it may be that in many communities it is going to be necessary for enterprising young people to leave. I think that there are some communities where no amount of economic development, no sensible amount of economic development, or programmatic economic development is really going to help.
So you've talked about the need for individual resiliency, and there's no question that if we're going to change our employer, how many times did you say, Mike?
Well, we're changing employers now 2 or 3 times. I'm saying in the future we'll probably change our occupation.
Our occupation.
Similar number, yes.
All right. Mike's talked about the need for nimbleness in our overall workforce delivery system, which includes the entire pipeline. What do you think about that?
I'm a very strong believer in lifetime learning. I've changed jobs more than I like to remember. And I think that, yeah, that sort of enabling people to quickly identify opportunities and get to them is important. I think we've started moving in that direction with our community college system. So there is some awareness of that, but certainly that nimbleness is important.
And Alexandra, you've already talked about the importance of nimbleness, but what other advice do you offer to the local practitioner whose job it is to try to ensure that there are jobs available for the people who live in their community?
Well, I think it will take a level of entrepreneurship on the part of those officials and on the part of communities that focus on innovation and entrepreneurship. How do we think about this new context? I will say that I would go back to, since folks have already talked about the lifelong learning and potentially the creation of opportunity, so how do we create businesses from within? I think removing the barriers now to make sure our future workforce is well positioned, has the skills, has the career readiness credentials to be nimble, to understand the opportunities, have the data, are informed with what is the opportunity in my community or in my region or in my state, my country. I think that's going to be critical. Those barriers exist. We know they exist for certain groups. Communities of color face greater barriers in achieving higher educational attainment. We need to address that now. We need to do that by providing every child with an early childhood experience, making sure that our schools have the resources to provide the training that we're talking about here in K through 12. Those sorts of investments and opportunities need to be happening now so that we make sure the gaps that exist now in income and opportunity don't exist in the future.
So that takes me to the next audience question, and I want to direct this to you, Mike. How do we protect workers in the emerging gig economy?
Well, by gig economy, I suspect the listener meant, or the viewer meant, the economy whereby people don't have a standard 9-to-5 job with benefits and vacation, etc. They're working from gig to gig, from job to job, and they're cobbling together. I think that's an excellent question. I think the trade-off is if we try to regulate some of these new emerging kinds of firms and jobs in terms of mandates for certain kinds of benefits. The concern is, I think Jay alluded to this, that maybe they'll argue that, well, labor's too expensive, I'm going to hasten our move to technology. This may be a role for public policy in the sense that if we worry about disturbing that employer-employee relationship, that if we impose regulations in terms of what kind of benefits are given, this may be the role then for the public sector to step in and say, we're going to, as through the Affordable Care Act or other things, we're going to be the provider of those kinds of benefits.
James, can we get Devin back on screen? Is that possible? I think this is the question for him. Devin, your institute is working with organizations and states all across the nation, and in North Carolina, we do not suffer from a lack of a competitive spirit. So people want to know which states are getting it right, which states are preparing themselves for the future of work. Where do you think North Carolina stands in line?
That's a good question. Only cursorily the question is being undertaken in North Carolina. So I think that the answer is that all of the states are in the earliest stages. So California has done quite a bit of public work in this area, but I don't know that anybody's quite got it yet. There is a piece, I think, that connects to a couple of the previous questions, in that I think one of the strategies that states are beginning to look at is how to apply these sorts of tools to public sector issues, right? Things that the public sector is already looking at. If you imagine, for example, unemployment or underemployment, let's say, as a kind of big mapping problem, and then look at, underlying, say, Uber or Airbnb, what they have is a really sophisticated matching engine, right? You can imagine redeploying these, these basic approaches to match people with jobs, match people with skills to get them to, to upskill to opportunities that may be slightly, more skilled than where they're at. So I think the states that are beginning to get it right are the states that are having that conversation. You know, not only how can we regulate this, and I think I'm still agnostic as to the degree to which this needs to be regulated. I do think we need positive platforms overall where the externalities on the whole are positive, but I'm not sure we know quite how to do that yet. But the states that are looking at how to actually apply these technologies or these approaches directly to their own problems, I think are the ones that are you know, kind of going to be the early stage, you know, kind of, they're going to be out ahead a little bit in this early stage of this.
Thanks, Devin. Appreciate it. So what are the opportunities as we think about how to apply this conversation to the public sector? Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, I think the first opportunity is to have a discussion about the educational system all the way from pre-K to four-year college and beyond that we need to address what many say is going to be a total overhaul of the workforce and a total change in where people work, how they work, the skills that they need, and how those skills are going to evolve over time. I don't want to overuse the word, but I think, again, we need a nimble system, a flexible educational system that's using all of the potential tools, recognize the fact people learn in different ways, that employ technology so that we can lower the cost, hopefully, of education, because I think that at the core is where that will save us, if I can use that term, because people will have to get reskilled, and they may have to get reskilled several times. So education, I think, is at the forefront here.
So, Alexandra, give me another opportunity for the public sector.
Well, for the public sector, I would say, I mean, I think this idea of deploying some of this technology in innovative ways to make sure that people have access to the programs and services in real time, just in time sort of opportunities, I think is really exciting. I'd be interested to see how to think through that in areas like unemployment insurance, access to food assistance. How do we make sure that people are connected to where the best opportunities are for them and for their family, and tailor that? I can't help but also emphasize that I think the real opportunity here is also to open up a conversation about income and about how we make sure that folks have the income they need to be consumers in an economy. We know our economy will continue to grow if people are spending on goods and services, even through these automation and disruptive moments. So how we talk about those issues and begin to think about the ways technology can support a stronger consumer base and better outcomes and well-being for families is going to be critical.
Right. Jay, you've talked about not getting in the way of the opportunities of the private sector. Give me a different opportunity for the public sector.
Okay, I would say that it's a good time for the public sector to really think about streamlining itself. And since I mean, my job focuses on education policy, I think that we've had very wasteful higher education policies in that we try to get everybody going to college, whether that's the right path for them or not. A lot of young people are winding up starting their lives without a degree, or with a degree that's not going to help them get a job, and $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 in debt. So we've got to start thinking, is a four-year college the right path for so many students? That's one area where we could kind of start to streamline and look at alternatives to the way we've been doing things in the past.
And are you suggesting that these new technological innovations, the sort of platforms that Devin mentioned, help us do a better job of identifying, as Mike has said, what are the jobs of the future, and encouraging people to move in those directions? Or
sure, we can pretty much identify who's going to do well, and these tools are certainly going to make that easier. And it might be better at an earlier age to start getting people to realize there are other opportunities for them. You know, they're not going to be the nuclear physicist, but they can have an extremely good job path. They can we can do things like have incremental learning to where somebody starts out learning a trade and then they can work into working in engineering, you know, through a combination of work and study. And we can do a lot of innovative things in that area where it's not just, okay, your standard, you go to elementary school, you go to high school, you go to college, but rethinking an entire career path.
So Mike, I want you to end for us on this note, because for decades we've been saying we need better real-time labor data to aid decision-making, and yet the volume of change that we're expecting and the rate of change that we're expecting in the next 2 decades boggles the mind to figure out how we would be able to offer that. What are the opportunities there?
Well, we do have annual occupational data for North Carolina in most states that comes out. I agree, I think that may be too slow. So I think an opportunity to employ some of this new technology and new gathering of data may be for some private sector companies to partner with the state and to perhaps on a sampling basis be able to get real-time data, monthly information, for example, on what the trends are in the labor market in terms of skills, occupations, location of jobs, etc.
Let me close by thanking our wonderful 3 panelists who joined us here in the Emerging Issues Commons, and Devin Fiddler, who joined us from California via New York, and all of you who joined us via this Google Hangout. As you can see, this is a big conversation. I think Mike said it may be the conversation of the century. I just said it was the conversation of the last 31 years of Emerging Issues Forum, so there you go. We want to continue it. We want to make sure that by the time we get to February, you've had an opportunity to contribute your thoughts, and we've had an opportunity to engage those thoughts so that the Emerging Issues Forum really does focus on exactly what the highest leverage points will be for North Carolina. With that said, I want to encourage you to continue to stay tuned. We're going to have a number of other virtual engagements as we move forward and toward February of 2016. It's going to be an important moment for North Carolina, and I want to be sure the next time somebody asks Devin Fiddler which states are getting it right, the first state out of his lips is North Carolina. Thank you so very much for joining us, and if you haven't registered for the Emerging Issues Forum, I encourage you to do it right now while the early bird registration is going on. With that, good day.